The first question is basically asking us to explain the quote, "The age of chivalry is gone, and an age of economics and calculators has succeeded." And so this basically means when Galliano is saying this, he's trying to say that the conquest is no longer done with like swords and armies, but instead with like money and trading and economic systems. So instead of direct colonial domination, countries like Europe used economic policies, trade rules, and financial pressures to control weaker nations. And so exploitation became more invisible, but just as effective and powerful. And so the second part, explain the role of independence in opening the doors to free competition from Europe already developing industries. And so as for independence, the text basically shows that it actually opened doors to this new kind of control. And so once Latin American countries became independent, they entered this global market as a free nation, except they were still weak and undeveloped. And so they were more economically weak. And so while this was happening, European countries were already strong. So this creates an unequal competition. And so as Latin America is getting exploited, Europe is flourishing. And so Latin America is just continuing to stay dependent and isn't able to industrialize. Question 2 asks us to explain in detail the War of the Triple Alliance against Paraguay and the role of England. So before the war, Paraguay was very different from Latin American countries. Under leaders like Carlos Antonio Lopez, it developed a self-sufficient economy, meaning that Paraguay relied mainly on itself instead of these other foreign countries. And so the government controlled much of the economy and invested in infrastructure and avoided the foreign debt. Now, because of this, Paraguay was more independent and less influenced by Europe. Then, when Francisco Solano Lopez came in power, tension had grew. Paraguay got involved in regional conflicts, especially when Brazil intervened in Uruguay. And Lopez saw this and he responded like militarily, which led to a war between all three countries. And the consequence led Paraguay to lose a huge part of its population, and the economy was destroyed, and it lost territory. So it was something that never fully recovered. Now with Britain, it supported countries like Brazil and Argentina through like loans and trade. These countries were already open to foreign investments, unlike Paraguay. So Paraguay's independent economic system limited British influence. So after the war, when Paraguay was defeated, the region became more open to foreign control and businesses. Question 3, explain what Galliano is arguing about sub-imperialism or imperialism of second degree with the connection between the U.S. and DR and the Brazilian universities. And so when Galliano is explaining the sub-imperialism, what he means is that power doesn't just go from the U.S. to these smaller countries. Instead, the U.S. uses strong Latin American countries like Brazil to control weaker ones like the Dominican Republic or Paraguay. So Galliano's main point is that even when it looks like countries such as Brazil have power, they're not truly independent because they are shaped by what the U.S.'s interests are. So this creates a system where domination is indirect but still manages to be effective since influence is pressed from one country to another. And he describes this as an echo, meaning that policies and controls coming from the U.S. are repeated through other nations, reinforcing the same type of dependency. 4, please explain how the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank emerged to help the U.S. to emulate Britain after World War II. So after World War II, the United States became the most powerful country in the world, surpassing the United Kingdom. And in order to maintain this influence, they created international institutions, including the Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, these institutions were designed to stabilize the global economy and provide loans for developing countries. And so, Galliano argues that it also helped expand the U.S.'s influence. The countries that had needed money had to follow economic conditions that included, by these institutions, that included opening their markets, reducing government control, and allowing for foreign investments. Because the U.S. had the most power within the IMF and the World Bank, it could shape these rules to benefit its own economic interests. Now, this allowed the U.S. to go beyond what Britain had done before. So instead of controlling colonies, they were controlling the economics through loans and financial systems. Question 5. What was the role of slavery to shape current social economic realities in Brazil? What was their impression of the discussion about race among university students in Brazil? And what is your overall take of how race functions in Brazilian society? And so throughout the video, it's clear that slavery played a huge role in Brazil until today. And Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other country in its entire economy. I mean, Brazil has sugar and agriculture, which with itself was built on slavery. Now, even after slavery had ended, formerly enslaved people were still left without support, which led to long-term inequality. And so because of this, many Black Brazilians today still face poverty and have limited opportunities, showing how the effects of slavery are still continuing until today. Now, race is understood differently here in Brazil than it is in the United States, as Brazil has many different labels for race and color, which can sometimes hide the real inequalities. And so I think that it's also really interesting how the students of the universities are openly talking about racism after Brazil promoted the idea of being a racial democracy for such a long time. And it's kind of showing that people are starting to recognize inequality and kind of challenge it. Question 6, explain why did the community of decided to put a gate and cameras? What were they trying to prevent, and how did the media react? And why do you think society does not question when wealthy and mostly white people do put gates and cameras in their community? And so in the community of this place, I'm not going to name it out loud, residents installed gates and cameras to try to protect themselves from violence, especially from police raids and outside threats. And so they're basically trying to control who enter the community and prevent invasions that put the residents in danger. And however, when this was put out to the media, it was kind of controversial, and there was a lot of negativity that went towards them because it was portrayed as suspicious and even criminal, suggesting that community was trying to hide illegal activity and stuff with drugs. And so I think this kind of reaction is like a double standard, because when most white people, white families, put up a gate, it's kind of seen as normal, and they're just trying to keep their family safe. But when a Black community does it, it's seen as dangerous, and drugs, assumptions and all that are involved. And I think, why do you think society does not question when most white people do? I think it's just stereotypes. I think most people assume that white people just want to protect their family, and they're not dangerous, while Black communities, they're assumed as dangerous and drug affiliated, and a lot of stuff with gangs and everything because of our history. And I think that kind of all of it itself is a double standard. 7 asks us, what do we think of this phrase, and does it dehumanize non-white people, and is that something we see in the U.S.? Why not, and how or not? And so I think this phrase shows how Afro-Brazilians are often dehumanized by unfair stereotypes, especially in places like favelas in Brazil. So instead of seeing people as individuals, society stereotypes entire communities, and just says that they're dangerous, which reinforces inequality and fear in Brazil. And so if I was asked if I see it a lot in the United States, I would say yes, but in a different form. White communities and Black communities have their own stereotypes given by the media, whereas Black communities don't have more criminal and dangerous activities. And this is all a big part of it that plays into that influences this is the housing and the education and the pricing within those types of markets between the white communities and Black communities. But the difference, I think, with the U.S. is that conversations about racism is a lot more open here, and it's a lot more discussed, not a lot, but the U.S. people have the right to speak about it, and it's discussed a good amount racism, whereas in Brazil they're still kind of hidden between like racial harmony and the idea that race doesn't exist in Brazil. So the eighth question asks, what is the myth of racial democracy that Coastal Vargas argues for, and what did you take that people think that the myth can be applied in the U.S. because we elected a black president? And so Coastal Vargas argues, calls the myth of racial democracy the idea that Brazil is free of racism because it has a mixed race population and promotes racial harmony. And so in reality, systematic inequality and discrimination against black and indigenous people still exist. And by saying that we have a racial harmony, it's ignoring racism instead of actually addressing it. And when it comes to us electing a president, by electing a black president, it is not erase structural racism like policing, housing, education, and healthcare, which cannot just go away because a black person was elected as president. And by using this one person's achievement to claim that the whole society is post-racial, ignores the real challenges that non-white communities end up facing. And basically this myth makes it feel like racism isn't a problem anymore, while inequalities and discrimination continue beneath the surface.